The scent of pine candles still lingered in the hallway as I stepped inside, their father holding Christmas gifts, just in time to hear my daughter-in-law whisper, "After Christmas, put your dad in a home. This house is ours now." As I froze behind the wall, my own son, my blood, just nodded like loyalty was something he'd outgrown. While the pine burned quietly, it choked the air between us, sharp enough to slice through 30 years of sacrifice. The same son I raised alone after his mother died, now stood by while they planned to erase me. That's when I saw it clearly. I wasn't family anymore. I was furniture they couldn't throw out fast enough. So I placed the gifts under their tree and signed the house to a realtor before their cocoa went cold. Before the story begins, tell me, where are you watching from? I hope your day's gentle and calm. Please like, subscribe, and let's start our story together. Snow clung to the edges of the narrow country road as Harold Bennett pulled into his son's driveway, the headlights catching the frost on the railings. In the passenger seat sat two warm, carefully wrapped homemade pies, his late wife's recipes, the ones everyone used to fight over during Christmas. He took a slow breath, letting the moment settle on him. Holidays hadn't felt the same since she passed, but tonight he had told himself, would be different. A full family Christmas, laughter, lights, maybe even a little healing. He stepped out, gripping the pies as he walked to the front door. Before he could knock, Sophie opened it, her expression tight and impatient, as if she'd been bracing herself for his arrival. Her eyes flicked from the pies to his overnight bag, and a thin, forced smile appeared. "Oh, Harold, you made it," she said, the warmth in her voice half a degree above freezing. Harold smiled anyway, choosing not to let her tone cut him. "Brought the pies you like," he said softly, lifting them. "Figured they'd taste better fresh." Sophie didn't respond to that. She just stepped aside stiffly, letting him enter. Inside, the house looked perfect, staged almost like something from a home magazine. But the air felt oddly tense, like someone had forgotten to turn on the heat. Mark appeared from the hallway, rubbing his palms on his jeans. "Hey, Dad," he said, giving Harold a quick hug that felt rushed, distracted. "Traffic all right?" "Smooth enough," Harold replied. "You okay, son?" Yeah, just a lot on my mind." Mark's eyes didn't stay on him for more than a second before darting toward Sophie, then back toward the tree. Harold knew that look. It was the look of a man caught between two currents, pulled by one, pushed by another. Still, he set his bag down and smiled. "Well, I'm glad to be here. Christmas Eve dinner smells good already." Sophie didn't answer. She was rearranging ornaments that didn't need rearranging, moving as though Harold's presence disrupted the room's balance. But Harold decided, for tonight, he would ignore the cold edges and focus on the warmth he'd come for. Megan appeared next, practically flying down the stairs in her fuzzy socks. "Grandpa," she shouted, launching herself into his arms. That finally softened the day. Harold hugged her tightly, breathing her in like fresh air. She pulled away and grinned at him, eyes bright with the kind of effortless love only children manage to hold on to. "You're sitting next to me at dinner," she declared. "I already saved you the seat." "Well, I wouldn't have it any other way," Harold said. Dinner passed in small conversations and quiet pauses. Mark barely spoke. Sophie cut into her meal with the precision of someone who wished she were doing something else. But Megan stayed by Harold's side all night, telling him about her school play, her grades, her new art project, anything just to fill the silence the adults kept leaving behind. By the time the dishes were washed and the lights dimmed, the house had settled into an uneasy quiet. Sophie announced she was heading to bed, reminding Mark, loud enough for Harold to hear, that they had a long day tomorrow. Mark nodded obediently. Harold pretended not to notice. He retired to the guest room, the one that used to feel welcoming but now felt temporary. He lay down, but sleep didn't come. Something about the whole evening had been off, colder than the winter outside. Near midnight, his throat dry, He slipped quietly out of bed and tiptoed to the kitchen for a glass of water. The house creaked under his steps, familiar but distant. As he rounded the corner, the glow of the stove light illuminated two silhouettes by the sink. He froze. It was Sophie and Mark whispering, urgent, low, too low. Harold instinctively stepped back into the shadow of the hallway, breath held. He didn't want to eavesdrop, but the tone, sharp, hurried, pulled him in before the words even reached his ears. Sophie's voice cut through the stillness first. "After Christmas," she hissed, "we put your dad in a home, Th. His house is ours now." Harold felt the words hit him before he fully understood them. Cold, brutal, final. His son didn't answer right away. Then came Mark's shaky voice, barely above a whisper. "Soft, Dad won't like that." The silence that followed felt deeper than the winter outside, heavier than the snow on the roof. Harold's hand tightened around the doorframe as he leaned back into the darkness, breath shallow, heart suddenly beating in a rhythm he didn't recognize. He didn't move, he didn't breathe. Because in that instant he understood. Tonight's tension wasn't random. It was a warning. And he had just stepped into the beginning of something far darker than a ruined holiday. Harold didn't mean to hear more. He truly didn't. But once the first sentence had landed like a blade between his ribs, the rest of the whispers seemed to draw him closer, holding him in a place he never wanted to stand. Sophie's voice, sharp as chipped glass, cut through the half-dark of the kitchen again. "After Christmas, put your dad in a home. This house is ours now." The words were spoken with such certainty, such ownership, that for a moment the floor seemed to tilt under Harold's feet. His breath hitched as he pressed his back against the wall, fighting to keep from staggering. The same woman who hugged him during Thanksgiving, the same one who once thanked him for helping with the down payment on this house, was now speaking about him as if he were already gone. Mark's voice followed, thin and unsure, the sound of a man who'd forgotten his spine somewhere along the way. "Soft, Dad won't like it." It wasn't a protest. It wasn't even a hesitation. It was an apology, a quiet excuse for why the plan might be inconvenient. Something inside Harold twisted. His son's tone wasn't protective. It was fearful, afraid of her, afraid of losing whatever dream she had stitched into his imagination. Sophie exhaled sharply, irritation dripping from every syllable. "We need that farmhouse money before the market drops. I'm not waiting another year for our life to start. Your dad can't live there forever. He's old, Mark. He shouldn't be alone out there anyway." Farmhouse money. Not memories. Not heritage. Not the place where Mark grew up, or where Harold buried his wife's ashes beneath the oak tree. Money. Harold's heart split cleanly down the center. He looked toward the faint glow of the Christmas tree reflecting down the hallway, tiny specks of red and gold blinking like distant warnings. Just hours earlier, he'd watched Megan hang the last ornament, the one her grandmother carved. He had felt so safe in that moment, so grateful, so hopeful. Now, hope felt like a luxury he was no longer allowed to afford. Sophie continued, her tone brisk and businesslike. "After Christmas, we start the process. No drama, just get him into a facility. I already found one with open rooms. Once he's settled, we list the farm and upgrade this place. We deserve better, Mark. I'm tired of living small." Living small. Harold swallowed hard, forcing air back into his lungs. That farm had sustained their family for decades. It was built by hand, his hands. Every board, every nail, every memory. And here she was, dismissing it like clutter in a garage. He felt himself retreat slowly, instinctively, one step at a time, like a man backing away from the edge of a cliff. He didn't want to hear any more. Something fragile inside him was starting to crack, and if he stayed another second, it would shatter loudly enough for them to hear. By the time he reached the guest room, his hands were trembling. He closed the door softly, the latch clicking like a final verdict on the night. He sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floorboards, wondering how betrayal could feel both sharp and numb at the same time. His throat tightened. He had survived grief. He had survived aging, but this felt like an amputation of family. He took a slow breath, steadying himself, trying to make sense of what he had just learned. But no matter how he turned it in his mind, the truth stayed brutal. They were planning to discard him like a burden, and then take the one thing he cherished more than anything left in this world. A soft knock tapped on the door. Before he could wipe his eyes, the door cracked open and Megan slipped inside, closing it quietly behind her. She didn't turn on the light. She simply approached him in the dim glow from the hallway. "Grandpa," she whispered, "are you okay? I thought I heard something." Harold forced a smile he didn't feel. He didn't want her caught in the crossfire of the ugliness he'd just witnessed. She was still innocent, still hopeful, still tender in a world that was starting to show its teeth. He cleared his throat. "Everything's fine, sweetheart," he said softly. "Just couldn't sleep. Long day, that's all." Her eyes searched his face in a way that made him feel exposed. She didn't believe him, but she wasn't old enough to challenge the lie. Instead, she leaned her head against his shoulder, her presence warm and anchoring. "I'm glad you're here," she murmured. Harold closed his eyes, letting her small confidence steady the storm inside him. But as she slipped back to her room and the house returned to silence, he knew the truth with painful clarity. Nothing was fine. Everything had just changed. And there was no going back. Morning light crept into the guest room long before Harold was ready to face it. He'd barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, Sophie's whisper replayed with bladed clarity. "After Christmas, put your dad in a home." The words clung to him like frost on glass, cold, stubborn, impossible to ignore. But when he finally rose and splashed water on his face, he practiced the smile he knew he'd need. Christmas morning wasn't the place for confrontation. Not yet. He walked into the living room where wrapping paper already littered the floor. Megan brightened instantly when she saw him, making room beside her on the couch. Sophie, wearing a bright red sweater and a saccharine smile, floated around the room with exaggerated cheerfulness. "There he is," she said, voice sweetened to the point of artificial. "Merry Christmas, Harold. We saved you a cinnamon roll." Her tone was drastically different from the venom he heard hours earlier. Harold offered a polite nod, the muscles in his face tightening as he forced a grateful smile. "Smells great," he said, sitting down carefully. They began opening gifts. Megan handed him a small package she'd wrapped in shiny blue paper. Inside was a simple bracelet she'd braided herself, deep greens and browns, colors of the farm. Harold swallowed hard as he pulled her into a gentle hug. "Thank you, sweetheart. I'll treasure it." Across the room, Sophie's smile flickered, then sharpened again. She handed him a sweater, expensive, tasteful, but remarkably impersonal. "Thought you'd like to look a little more modern," she said lightly. He thanked her, though the words tasted heavy. Mark sat beside Sophie, rubbing his hands together, looking everywhere except at his father. After a few moments, he cleared his throat. "Dad, I've been thinking. Maybe after the holidays you should, well, maybe consider downsizing." Harold felt his breath still. The smile he held in place stretched thin. Here it was, the rehearsed line, the gentle precursor to the shove out the door. He met Mark's eyes, and for a fleeting moment he searched for the boy he once carried on his shoulders. Instead, he saw uncertainty and someone else's agenda sitting behind his gaze. "Downsizing," Harold repeated quietly, keeping his tone neutral. "You know," Mark continued, glancing nervously at Sophie, "the farmhouse is a lot to manage on your own. It might be time to simplify." Sophie leaned in, offering a supportive pat on Mark's knee, as if he were the brave one in the conversation. "It's about your safety, Harold. We just want what's best." Harold nodded slowly. He didn't trust his voice yet, so he said nothing. Instead, he focused on Megan. She watched the exchange with furrowed brows, then looked quickly at Harold, silently asking if he was all right. He answered her with a small smile. Trying to change the mood, Harold reached into his bag for the small packet of family documents he brought. Old letters, recipes, the deed photocopy, the history of the land he and his wife built their lives upon. He laid them carefully on the coffee table, thinking his granddaughter might enjoy flipping through their past. But before Megan could reach them, Sophie swooped in like a hawk spotting something shiny. She picked up the papers, her brow tightening in calculation. Her eyes scanned the titles: Property Deed, Bennett Family Land, Maps, 1979. Her fingers lingered on the deed photocopy, tracing the bold letters with uncanny interest. "These are interesting," she murmured, pretending casual curiosity. Harold watched her closely. She wasn't admiring history. She was evaluating assets. He felt the air in the room thicken. She handed the documents back with a rehearsed smile, but Harold saw something cold flicker in her eyes, ambition, sharpened and hungry. A buzz sounded from his phone. Harold discreetly checked it. A message from Megan. "I heard them last night." His chest tightened, a faint ache blooming under his ribs. She shouldn't have had to hear any of it. She shouldn't have known that adults were capable of such quiet cruelty. His hand drifted to his chest, hurt but steady. He looked over and found her watching him with soft, worried eyes. He smiled gently, reassuring her without words. He wasn't crushed, he wasn't broken, he was awakening. Because in the middle of this bright, cheerful living room, with the Christmas tree glowing and wrapping paper everywhere, a profound certainty settled into him, firm as the roots of the oak tree behind the farmhouse. They would not take what he and his late wife built. Not the land, not the home, not the legacy. He felt his heart steady, the grief cooling into resolve. Christmas morning continued around him, laughter forced, smiles stiff. But in Harold's mind, something fundamental had shifted. The betrayal wasn't just something he overheard. It was now something he understood fully and painfully. And as he sat quietly among his own family, he knew one thing with absolute clarity. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning. The drive home felt longer than any road Harold had ever taken, though he'd driven this route hundreds of times over the decades. Snow drifted across the pavement in soft waves, the kind that made the world look peaceful, if not for the storm quietly tearing its way through his chest. He kept one hand steady on the steering wheel, the other gripping the edge tighter each time Sophie's words replayed in his mind. After Christmas, put your dad in a home. He had held himself together in front of them. He had smiled, laughed, even pretended the world wasn't tilting beneath his feet. But now, alone in the cab of his old Ford, the weight of everything finally crashed through the dam. Tears slipped down his face. Slow, uncontrollable, years of love and trust collapsing under the knowledge that his own family had calculated his removal like a business decision. The farmhouse appeared through the winter haze, its familiar silhouette rising from the snow-covered land like an old sentinel waiting for him. He pulled into the driveway, engine rumbling softly before he shut it off. For a long moment he just sat there, letting the silence settle. This land had held him through grief, through joy, through the long years after his wife passed. And now, the very people who should have protected it wanted to sell it off for convenience. He stepped out, boots crunching into the snow. The cold air wrapped around him, sharp and bracing. As he approached the front door, memories nudged at him, his wife's laugh echoing through the halls, the smell of her bread on Saturday afternoons, the sound of Mark running across the porch as a child. By the time he stepped inside, Harold felt those ghosts walking with him, steadying him. The house welcomed him with the familiar creak of old wood. He moved slowly from room to room, touching frames, brushes of fabric, pieces of furniture his wife had insisted on keeping even when they'd outgrown them. In the living room, he paused by the rocking chair she used during the late nights with newborn Mark. In the kitchen, He rested a hand on the counter she sanded and refinished herself. Every corner held a piece of her, and of him, and of the life they'd built brick by brick, paycheck by paycheck, love by stubborn love. He whispered into the quiet, "They don't understand this place. They don't understand you." His voice trembled, but not from weakness this time, from a rising certainty. He walked to the back bedroom, the one that had remained untouched since she passed. At the foot of the old cedar dresser sat a metal lockbox, scratch marks on the edges from years of being moved, but still sturdy, still reliable. He knelt, took out the small brass key from his wallet, a key he'd carried since 1978, and opened the lid. Inside lay the original documents, the deed to the farmhouse, the land surveys, the signatures he and his wife placed together when they first bought the property. The paper had yellowed, but the ink felt eternal. He lifted it gently, letting the reality settle in his bones. Mark and Sophie had no idea what a life estate was. They had no idea how ownership of the land actually worked. Sophie saw a number, a sale price, a stepping stone to some remodeled suburban dream. But she didn't understand the legal roots of the property. She didn't understand that Harold wasn't as vulnerable as she assumed. He exhaled slowly, a long, grounding breath. Then he reached for the phone. His hand shook once, then steadied. He dialed the number he'd memorized decades earlier, the one man he trusted whenever life presented a crossroads. Attorney Paul Whitman answered on the second ring, his voice groggy but alert. "Paul," Harold said, trying to keep the emotion out of his voice. I need to meet, today if possible." There was a brief pause on the other end, as if Paul could hear everything Harold wasn't saying. "Come in within the hour," Paul replied. "Bring whatever documents you have." Harold hung up and stared again at the deed resting in his hands. A quiet fire lit inside him, small but growing, steady and warm. He gathered the papers carefully, placed them into a leather folder, and stood. Less than an hour later, he sat across from Paul in the old oak-paneled office. The attorney adjusted his glasses, scanned the documents, and leaned back slowly, looking at Harold with a mixture of reassurance and something close to admiration. "Harold," he said, voice firm, "you're not losing anything. In fact, you're about to gain control." The words hit him with unexpected force. Control, something he hadn't felt since the whispers in that kitchen shattered his peace. Harold sat a little straighter. His shoulders rolled back. His breath deepened. And for the first time since Christmas Eve, he felt a flicker of strength returning, steady, sharp, and ready. Because this wasn't the end of something. It was the start of a fight he suddenly knew he could win. Paul's office smelled faintly of old books and cedar polish, the same way it had 30 years ago when Harold and his late wife first signed papers for the land. Sitting there now, with winter light spilling weakly across the polished desk, Harold felt both older and strangely steadier, like this room still remembered the man he once was and expected him to find his footing again. Paul slid his glasses higher on his nose and tapped the stack of documents between them. "Harold," he began slowly, "before we talk about anything new, I need to show you something your wife did years ago." Harold's breath caught. Whenever someone mentioned her in the past tense, it felt like a small bruise pressing down. What did she do? Paul pulled out a thin folder, marked with a date from over a decade earlier. "Your wife filed a life estate on the property. Everything from the house to the last boundary marker. She secured it. That means no one can force you out, not Mark, not Sophie, not any buyer, not a facility. You have legal rights to live on that land for the rest of your life." For a moment, Harold simply blinked. The room seemed to shift around him. She never told me." "She didn't need to," Paul said gently. "Life estates are often set up quietly, meant to protect the surviving spouse without causing family friction. She must have wanted to make sure you'd never be pushed aside." A soft exhale escaped Harold's lips, part relief, part grief. He hadn't known how much tension he was holding until it began to drain from his shoulders. The farmhouse wasn't slipping away from him. His wife, long gone from this world, had already built him armor he didn't know he had. He lowered his gaze, voice thick. She always thought ahead, always worried I'd give too much of myself away. Well, Paul said with a wry smile, looks like she took care of that for you. But then the attorney pulled another document from the pile, placing it deliberately between them. And that brings us to the next step. Harold straightened. Next step. Paul folded his hands. Given what you've told me, Sophie's ambitions, Mark's compliance, I strongly suggest putting the farmhouse into an irrevocable trust. Not for everyone, for Megan only. It ensures the property goes to someone who values its meaning. The word struck Harold like a sudden gust of warm air. Megan, sweet, loyal Megan, who hugged him tighter than her own father did, who looked at the farm as though it were part of her childhood landscape, not just an asset. Only her, he asked quietly. Only her, Paul confirmed. Once the trust is filed, no one else can touch that land. Not to sell it, not to flip it, not to borrow against it. It becomes hers, after your lifetime, and yours remains protected until then. Harold stared at the papers, the weight of what they represented settling deep in his bones. Protection he never imagined, control he thought he'd lost, and a future for his granddaughter that no amount of greed could spoil. Shock mingled with gratitude, and for the first time since Christmas Eve, his breathing felt steady. His world wasn't collapsing, it was realigning. Then Paul pulled out another sheet, his tone sharpened. And before you think this is overreacting, you need to see this. Harold leaned in. The page was a printed copy of a county inquiry log. Sophie's name appeared beside questions about property taxes, potential sale estimates, and zoning restrictions. His stomach twisted. She was looking into this months ago. August, Paul said, well before the holidays. The betrayal deepened, not like a sudden stab, but a long, slow pull of a knife that had been lodged inside him long before he realized it. All the odd comments, the sudden interest in his health, the exaggerated concern about him living alone. It hadn't been worry. It had been strategy. Harold closed his eyes. In that moment, the memory of Christmas morning, the fake cheer, the artificial smile, burned with new clarity. They hadn't turned on him last night. They had simply revealed what they had been planning all along. He opened his eyes again, and Paul watched him with the patient, steady look of a man who'd seen many families unravel over property lines. Harold, he said quietly, I need to ask you something. It matters for how we move forward. Harold nodded once. Do you want peace or justice? The words hung in the air, heavy as snowfall on old branches. Peace would mean compromising, letting things slide, hoping time healed wounds. Justice meant showing Mark and Sophie exactly what they had tried to take, and that they had failed. Harold inhaled slow. Feeling his spine straighten, his purpose crystallizing. He thought of his wife's touches on every beam in that house, Megan's trust in him, and the land that had carried his entire life. I want them, Harold said, voice steady and low, to understand what family means. Paul nodded, then let's begin. Harold heard the truck long before it pulled into the driveway. The crunch of tires on gravel, the hesitant rumble of an engine that idled a little too long before shutting off. He wiped his hands on a dish towel and stood quietly at the sink, watching the frost gather on the porch railing. Mark never came unannounced, not unless something was brewing. A moment later there was a knock, soft, uneven, like a man rehearsing courage on the doorstep. Harold opened the door, and there was his son, shoulders hunched, jaw tight, eyes darting everywhere except at his father's. He looked like someone who had practiced a speech in the mirror and still didn't believe a word of it. Dad, Mark said, forcing a smile that didn't stay long, mind if I come in? Harold stepped aside, doors always open. Mark walked into the living room, pausing near the old rocking chair as if it were judging him. He rubbed his palms on his jeans the way he did as a teenager whenever he was about to confess something unpleasant. Except this time, the unpleasantness wasn't his own mistake. It was the plan he'd agreed to carry out. Mark began, clearing his throat. I've been thinking a lot about you, about the farm, about how much work it is out here. Harold watched him calmly, giving him space to say what he'd clearly been dispatched to deliver. Mark drew a breath and pushed out the practice line. Dad, you need supervised care. The words hung there, heavy and false. Mark didn't believe them, not entirely. He said them like a script, like something drilled into him until he could repeat it without choking on the guilt. Harold didn't react. His stillness made Mark fidget. You're alone out here, Mark continued. The farm's a lot for someone your age. You could fall or, I don't know, forget to turn the stove off. You need help, professional help. He sounded more nervous with each sentence. Harold wondered how many times he'd rehearsed this speech in the car. 10, 20. Before Harold could respond, the front door swung open without knocking. Sophie swept in like a gust of cold wind disguised as confidence. Good, she said briskly, you're already talking. She pulled brochures from her oversized purse and set them neatly on Harold's coffee table, the same table his wife refinished by hand. These are the top facilities in the county, all 5-star. Great medical staff, social activities, clean rooms. You'll love them. She didn't offer these with compassion. She offered them like a sales pitch. Harold kept his gaze steady, saying nothing. Sophie smiled with smug satisfaction, as if she thought the silence meant compliance. She continued flipping pages, pointing at amenities he never asked for, tapping her manicured nails on pictures of cheerful seniors playing bingo under fluorescent lights. Mark paced behind her, uneasy. It's not that we're trying to get rid of you, he muttered, avoiding eye contact. We just want what's best. Megan, who had been upstairs doing homework, walked down halfway through Sophie's presentation. She froze on the last step when she saw the brochures and the expression on Sophie's face. It wasn't concern. It wasn't care. It was triumph. Something inside Megan's face hardened, a quiet fury she was too young to mask. She didn't speak, but she didn't need to. Sophie caught the look and quickly turned her attention back to her display, pretending not to notice. Harold finally reached for one of the brochures, not to read it, but to look at the glossy cover of Smiling Strangers and feel the absurdity of what they were trying to force. His hands remained steady, his voice calmer than anyone expected. Tell me, he said quietly, what happens to the house? Sophie answered too fast, too confidently, revealing more than she intended. Well, once you're moved, we can. We? Harold asked softly. She blinked, caught off guard. Mark swallowed, stepping forward as if to soften the blow. Dad will take care of it. Manage things, it's better if. But before he could finish, Sophie, unable to hide her eagerness, blurted out the truth. We already talked to a realtor. The room fell into a silence, so sharp it felt like glass underfoot. Mark closed his eyes, recognizing the mistake. Megan stiffened, jaw tightening. Harold simply let out a small breath, slow, controlled, the final confirmation of everything he already knew. He placed the brochure back on the table, lining it up neatly with the others, his movements deliberate, almost ceremonial. Then he looked at them, not with anger, but with a clarity that made Sophie shift her weight and Mark look away. Is that so? He said. Nothing else, just that. But the two, knee calm, precise, unshaken, made both of them realize he wasn't folding. He wasn't frightened. He wasn't confused. He was preparing. Sophie forced a brittle smile, but her fingers tightened on the strap of her purse. We're only trying to help, she insisted. Harold didn't answer. Because right then, he didn't need to. He had all he needed. Information, confirmation, and a quiet, growing power they didn't yet see coming. Snow still clung stubbornly to the morning ground when Harold heard the tires crunching down his driveway again. He looked out the kitchen window and saw Sophie stepping out of her SUV, dressed in a coat far too expensive for farm soil. Behind her came a second car, a professional sedan, its door opening to reveal a woman in a tailored navy blazer, clutching a leather portfolio. A realtor. So Sophie hadn't wasted a minute. Harold wiped his hands on a towel and stepped onto the porch just as they approached. The realtor extended her hand with a gracious smile. "Mr. Bennett, I'm Linda Price. Thank you for having me." Before Harold could respond, Sophie slid in front of him with an eager brightness that nearly sparkled. "Linda's the top realtor in the county," she announced. "Specializes in high-value rural property. I told her we might list sooner rather than later." Linda's eyes flicked subtly to Sophie's overreach, then back to Harold with quiet respect. "If you're considering selling," she said gently, "I wanted to get a look at the home first, get a feel for the land." Harold opened his mouth to answer, but Sophie barreled over him again. "Yes, absolutely. We want a quick turnaround. So let's start in the living room. There are some updates we're thinking of making after things settle." Linda hesitated, sensing something off, but followed Sophie inside. Harold walked a few steps behind, watching as Sophie gestured wildly around the living room, talking about potential renovations, widening doorways, and maybe knocking out that wall. She spoke like the house already belonged to her, like Harold was simply a stubborn old relic taking up space in a project she'd already designed in her head. Every few sentences, Sophie would turn and address Linda, blocking Harold's attempts to speak. "This part of the house is outdated but fixable. He's lived here forever, so yes, it needs modernization. We'd want the listing up before spring." Harold finally exhaled through his nose, a breath steady enough to keep him from breaking his calm. "If you'll excuse me," he said quietly, "the chickens aren't going to feed themselves." Sophie waved a dismissive hand without even looking at him. "Sure, sure, do what you need to." But Linda paused. Her eyes followed Harold as he walked out the back door. Something in his posture, dignified, tired, patient, didn't match Sophie's narrative. After a moment, she gently excused herself and followed him into the chilly air. Harold was scattering grain across the dirt, moving slowly but purposefully when she approached. He didn't greet her right away. He simply let the quiet settle between them until she spoke. "Mr. Bennett," she said softly, "I hope you don't mind me stepping out here. I wanted to apologize." He glanced at her. "For what?" "For her behavior." Linda lowered her voice, glancing at the house. "She's enthusiastic, but she seems to be speaking for you, and a property like this shouldn't be rushed into anything. Selling a family home is a major decision." Harold rested his hands on the feed bucket, the cold metal grounding him. "Linda," he said quietly, "this house isn't theirs to sell." Her expression shifted, first confusion, then comprehension, then something like restrained concern. She took a small step closer, lowering her voice further. "I didn't think it was," she murmured. "She talks like the deed is already in their name." "It's not," Harold said, "and it won't be." The wind cut through the yard, sending a thin spray of snow across the coop. Linda looked back at the farmhouse, her jaw tightening slightly as if calculating the unfolding storm. "You don't owe me any details," she said carefully, "but I will tell you this. Sophie came to my office last week asking for market estimates. She seemed impatient. I assumed you were leading the sale." She shook her head. "Now I see that's not the case." Harold nodded once, grateful but not surprised. "They have ideas," he said, "but ideas don't outweigh the law." Her eyes sharpened, not with opportunism but with a professional alertness. "This is your home," she said. "Yours. If you need clarity or protection at any point, I'm here." Discreetly. He studied her for a moment. She wasn't choosing sides blindly. She was choosing integrity. "I appreciate that," Harold said. Linda smiled faintly. And Mr. Bennett, if they try to move fast or pressure you into anything, call me before signing a single word. I've seen families tear themselves apart over property. I'd rather not watch it happen again. He looked at the farmhouse, the porch his wife painted, the roof he patched every winter, the land that held every memory that mattered. I won't let them take it, he said quietly. Linda nodded. Good, because they're in their right now talking about flipping the kitchen. Harold let out a slow, controlled breath, neither amused nor angry, just ready. Linda tucked her portfolio under her arm. If you need me, she whispered, I'm on your side. And as they walked back toward the house, Harold felt the shift, subtle but unmistakable. He wasn't alone in this fight anymore. The morning Harold returned to Paul Whitman's office. The winter sun was thin and pale, barely touching the frost on the sidewalk. But inside Harold's chest, something warmer had begun to move, a slow ignition, a quiet certainty that he was no longer reacting to what had been done to him. He was preparing his counterstroke. Paul greeted him with a nod that held both respect and readiness. You brought the documents, he asked. Harold placed the folder on the desk, smoothing the edges with deliberate care. Everything you asked for. They sat, papers unfolded. Signatures were placed with the firmness of a man reclaiming ground he'd been pushed away from. Paul explained each form in detail, making sure Harold understood the gravity of what they were doing. This irrevocable trust, Paul said, tapping the top page, will secure the property until the day you pass. No one, not your son, not Sophie, not any financial institution, can challenge your ownership or force a sale. Harold listened, absorbing each word like armor sliding into place. And Megan, he asked. Paul smiled. After your lifetime, the entire farm transfers directly to her. No ambiguity, no loopholes. Harold exhaled, not in relief alone, but in gratitude, for his late wife's foresight, for Paul's loyalty, and for the chance to preserve something sacred. Let's finish it, he said. They signed the final page. Paul stamped it, and with that, the transition from vulnerability to power completed its quiet arc. Later that afternoon, Megan arrived at the office, her backpack slung over one shoulder, cheeks flushed from the cold. She had no idea why her grandfather had asked her to come, but she walked in with that same blend of trust and innocence that made Harold's heart ache. Paul gestured toward Harold. Your grandfather asked me to explain something to you. Harold watched her closely, steadying himself. Megan, he said gently, someday long from now, the farm is going to be yours. She blinked, mine. He nodded, sliding the trust document toward her. Your grandmother and I built that place with our hands. It deserves someone who respects it, someone who understands where it came from. Her eyes widened slowly, the realization sinking in. And then the tears came, quiet, careful, as though she didn't want to embarrass herself in front of the attorney. Grandpa, I don't know what to say. You don't need to say anything, Harold replied. He rested a weathered hand on hers. Just promise me you'll love that land, and that you'll protect it. I will, she whispered. I swear I will. For Harold, it was the first moment in days that felt light, pure, even, but practical matters still loomed. He turned back to Paul. We keep this between us for now. Paul raised an eyebrow, not telling Mark. No, Harold said, voice firm. Not until they show exactly how far they plan to go. I don't want them changing their strategy. I want them revealing it. Paul nodded slowly. Then we'll keep everything sealed until you give the word. They moved on to the next task, documentation Sophie would never expect. Paul prepared notices, verification letters, digital timestamps, and certified copies of every document filed with the county. Paperwork that would hold up in any court. Paperwork that would make any challenge look reckless. By the time they try something, Paul said, they'll be standing on a trap they built themselves. Harold left the office that day with a different posture, not defeated, not afraid, but fortified. The trust papers sat inside his coat like a second heartbeat. Back at the farmhouse, he rolled up his sleeves and got to work, not out of necessity but strategy. He swept the barn, cleared the hayloft, repaired a hinge on the back gate. He washed the windows, polished the old oak banister, hauled debris from the yard. He wanted the property ready, not for their appraisal, but for his. The appraisal that mattered, the one Linda would help with when the time was right. As he worked, the quiet land whispered reminders of who he truly was, not the helpless old man Sophie pictured, not the burden Mark had been manipulated into fearing, but the builder of this place, the man whose hands had shaped every corner. With every nail he tightened, every board he straightened, a plan continued forming, not hurried, not vengeful, but patient and precise. He wasn't going to expose their intentions. He was going to let them expose themselves. And when they did, when their greed finally overplayed its hand, Harold would be ready, with documents, with truth, and with the kind of strength only a betrayed father could wield. As dusk settled over the farmhouse, Harold stood on the porch, watching the snow drift through the fading light. His breath fogged in the cold, but inside him, something had never felt clearer. Let them come. Let them show their true motives. He was done being the prey. The pressure began tightening even before the New Year decorations went up in town. Harold noticed it first in the frequency of Mark's calls, short, clipped conversations where Mark cleared his throat more than he spoke. Then came the messages from Sophie, pretending to check on him, though all her questions circled the same target. Are you still alone out there? Things must be getting harder, right? Harold saw through it. Paul had warned him they'd push now, fast, thinking he was vulnerable, thinking he had no legal ground to stand on. But Harold had learned patience on this land, and patience now served him better than anger. One icy morning, Mark showed up unannounced, pacing by the porch steps like someone practicing lines in the cold. When Harold opened the door, his son straightened as if bracing for impact. "Dad," Mark began, voice strained, "we need to talk. Sophie and we think it's time to schedule your move. After New Year, that gives us a clean start." Harold leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed loosely. "A clean start," he repeated, watching for the flicker in Mark's eyes. Mark swallowed. "Yeah, a plan, a timeline, it's what's best for everyone." For everyone but him. Harold didn't respond immediately. Instead, he let silence stretch between them, long enough that Mark began fidgeting again. Sweat beaded at his temples despite the cold. "I haven't decided," Harold said finally in a tone calm enough to unsettle. "It's a big choice, I'll think on it." Mark's shoulders sagged with visible relief, as if he'd feared confrontation and escaped it barely. Harold noted the reaction closely. His son wasn't leading this charge. He was being pushed into it, molded into it. As Mark exhaled, Sophie's car whipped into the driveway, spraying slush. She got out with the urgency of someone late for a meeting about her property. "Did you tell him?" she demanded, not even glancing at Harold. Mark nodded weakly. "He said he'll think about it." Sophie turned toward Harold, her expression flat, her voice stripped of pretense. "Harold, this is long overdue. You can't expect us to put our lives on hold forever." "I never asked you to," he replied quietly. "That's not the point," she snapped. "You're being selfish. You need more care than you realize, and this place," she gestured broadly at the farmhouse, "is too much for you. Forcing us to wait is only making things harder." Harold let the accusation hang in the air. Selfish. After decades of caring for this home, for Mark, for his late wife. After building the very place Sophie now considered an inconvenience. He simply nodded, hiding the flicker of anger rising in his chest. "I'll consider your request," he said again, voice steady. But Sophie didn't want steady. She wanted surrender. Over the next week, her behavior escalated. She began showing up without calling, wandering through the house with her eyes narrowed and calculating. And one afternoon, when Harold returned from the barn, he found her dragging boxes out of the living room, his living room, stacking them by the front door. "What are you doing?" Harold asked, his voice edged with something sharper than patience. "Getting a head start," Sophie said briskly. "No point waiting. These things can go to storage. The less clutter, the easier the transition." "Whose transition?" Harold asked, stepping closer. She didn't even look at him. "Yours." But before Harold could respond, a voice came from the doorway. "Mom, stop." Megan stood there, phone in hand, eyes wide with disbelief and fury. "You don't have permission to move any of his things." Sophie straightened, her tone instantly defensive. "I'm helping him." "No, you're helping yourself," Megan shot back. "You're acting like he's already gone." The words cut straight through the room. Sophie's face twisted. "Don't talk to me like that. I'm trying to do what's best for this family." Megan raised her phone. "I'm recording this." Sophie froze. Harold hadn't known Megan was there, hadn't known she'd witnessed this level of disrespect. But now she stood between them, 16 years old, trembling but unwavering. "Put it back," Harold said gently. Megan hesitated, then lowered her phone, stepping to his side. Sophie stared at them, her jaw clenched, her eyes cold and humiliated. She grabbed her purse, muttered something under her breath, and stormed out. Her car peeled out of the driveway seconds later. When the sound faded, Harold stood in the quiet living room, looking at the half-packed boxes, the scattered memories stuffed into cardboard as if they meant nothing. That was the moment he finally saw it fully, clearly, without excuse or hope of misunderstanding. Sophie didn't see him as a man. She didn't even see him as family. She saw him as gone. And in her mind, he already was. Harold took a slow, deliberate breath. If that was the game she wanted to play, then she had no idea what was coming next. Harold waited until the house settled into its usual post-holiday rhythm. Mark checking emails, E didn't actually read, Sophie pacing around rearranging throw pillows, Megan quietly doing homework at the far end of the dining table. The tension still hung in the air from the week's arguments, but Sophie had gone unusually quiet, watching Harold as if waiting for him to slip. He decided the moment had come. He walked into the living room, hands folded behind him, wearing the same calm expression he used when repairing fence posts, steady, unreadable. "I've been thinking," he said, letting his voice carry just enough weight. "After Christmas weekend, I'll consider moving." Sophie's head snapped up so fast her hair whipped over her shoulder. Her eyes widened and the transformation in her face was instantaneous, like a gambler seeing all the cards fall her way. "You will," she squealed, borderline giddy. "Oh, Harold, that's wonderful news." Mark exhaled deeply, shoulders dropping in visible relief. "Dad, that's great. I know it wasn't easy to think about." Harold nodded once, slow and deliberate. "Still need some time to sort things out, but yes, I'll think about it." That single sentence, strategically vague, landed exactly where he wanted. Mark heard hope. Sophie heard victory. And she celebrated far too early. She rushed toward the kitchen counter, grabbing her phone. "If we start planning renovations now, we can have the place updated by spring. New flooring, new cabinets, maybe open the kitchen wall. Oh my God, finally." She laughed breathlessly, already swiping through contractor contacts. "Mark, we have to bring the guys in to measure the space. This is perfect timing." Mark hesitated, glancing at his father, guilt flickering briefly. But Sophie nudged him with her elbow. "Go on, call them. If we get quotes before January, we'll save thousands." Mark nodded weakly. "Sure, yeah, I'll make a few calls." Harold stood quietly, watching them with an expression no one bothered to interpret. They were too busy celebrating a victory they thought was certain, a victory already dissolving beneath their feet. Sophie walked around the house with her phone held high, recording short videos to send to contractors. Angles of the kitchen, close-ups of cabinets she wanted replaced, commentary about our remodel. She hadn't even waited 5 minutes before acting like the place was already hers. Mark followed behind her, muttering concerns about budget, but Sophie brushed each one aside. "This house is our chance," she insisted. "Once he moves, everything changes." Through it all, Harold sat at the kitchen table, the soft winter light falling across the papers spread before him. Not moving forms, not facility admission packets, not anything Sophie believed he was signing. These were the final trust documents. The binding, irrevocable, legally ironclad papers ensuring that every plank, every acre, every memory-laced corner of the farm would go directly to Megan, and that Mark and Sophie were cut out entirely, permanently, without loophole or challenge. He read each page thoroughly, not from doubt but from reverence. He felt his wife's presence in the quiet, as though she stood behind him, hand on his shoulder, nodding her approval. The pen sat heavy in his fingers, but his hand did not shake. He signed the last document with the calm certainty of a man reclaiming his own story. When the final signature dried, he slipped the stack into a manila envelope, sealed it, and placed it gently inside his briefcase. Then he picked up the phone and called Paul. "It's done," Harold said. Paul's voice warmed across the line. "I'll file everything today. Once it's stamped, no one can touch that property except you and Megan." Harold exhaled slowly. "Thank you." Across the room, Sophie's laughter rang out as she walked through the hallway, imagining her future kitchen island, her new floors, the walls she planned to demolish the moment Harold moved out. She thought she was standing on the threshold of ownership. She didn't know she was standing on quicksand. Mark wandered into the kitchen, rubbing the back of his neck. "Dad, I know this whole thing has been stressful, but I really think you'll like the facility we picked. They've got classes and staff on duty all day, and it's closer to us. You'll be taken care of." Harold simply nodded. He didn't need to argue, he didn't need to fight. He just needed them to keep showing who they were. And they did. Over and over. Sophie re-entered, cheeks flush with excitement. "Once we get the contractors in, things will really start moving. You'll love how the place turns out after we update it. Modern, fresh, exactly what this house deserves." She didn't notice the envelope in Harold's briefcase. She didn't notice the quiet strength in his expression. She didn't notice she'd already lost. Because in her mind and Mark's, they had already won. They believed they were days away from taking everything. They had no idea they were already legally cut out of it all. Harold rose from the table, tea. He soft click of the briefcase latch, echoing through the room like the first note of a coming storm. They thought they were in control. They had no idea. Linda arrived just after dawn, her breath misting in the cold air as she stepped out of her sedan with a clipboard tucked beneath her arm. She had called the night before, her voice careful, asking if Harold wanted a quiet assessment, one not connected to Sophie or anyone else. He'd agreed immediately. Now, as she approached the farmhouse with its frost-tipped roof and long winter shadows, she gave him a warm nod, one professional, one personal. "Morning, Mr. Bennett," she said, "ready to get started." Harold opened the front door, motioning her inside. "Call me Harold, and yes, let's see what this old place is worth." Linda walked through the house with deliberate attention, not like a realtor chasing a sale, but like someone who understood history, lived in wood grain and worn carpets. She took measurements, photos, notes. Every so often her brow lifted, her pencil pausing mid-stroke as though the property were surprising her. When they stepped into the main bedroom, the one his wife once decorated in soft blue tones, Linda stopped completely. "Harold," she murmured, "I have to tell you, this property is something rare. The acreage alone is worth more than I expected. But the condition of the home, the outbuildings, the barn, this is going to appraise higher than anything in this area has in years." Harold chuckled softly, leaning against the doorframe. Higher, huh? And here Sophie thought she'd flip it for some quick cash. Linda gave a half-smile filled with understanding. Well, if she had gotten her hands on it, she wouldn't have known what to do with this kind of value. This isn't a flip house. It's legacy land. She finished her notes, then gestured for them to head outside. The cold stung their cheeks as they crossed toward the barn, its red paint faded, the doors hanging slightly crooked, but still standing proudly after decades of storms and summers. Linda stepped inside and whispered, amazed, "I can't believe how solid this structure is. These beams, you don't see wood like this anymore." "My wife picked every board," Harold said. "Insisted we build it to last." "Well," Linda replied, "she was right. This is exactly the kind of feature buyers fight over." She listed them aloud. Retired couples wanting farmland, families seeking multi-acre homesteads, preservationists who valued history, even a local agricultural group that had expressed interest in maintaining iconic community properties. But with each name, she added something important. "Only if you choose," she emphasized. "This is your call, not your son's, not Sophie's." Her loyalty, so firm and simple, made Harold stand a little straighter. They stepped deeper into the barn, dust dancing in the slivers of morning light. As Linda measured the rafters, Harold heard footsteps behind him. He turned to see Megan standing at the entrance, bundled in an oversized coat, smiling shyly. "Mom dropped me off early," she said. "I wanted to help." Linda's face brightened. "Good timing, you can help me dust these shelves. We need to see their condition." Megan grabbed an old rag from a hook and climbed onto a wooden crate, swiping at decades of settled dust. She giggled when a cloud puffed into the air, floating into a sunbeam. Harold watched her, his heart softening. She looked so at home here, more than Mark ever had, more than Sophie ever could be. She touched everything gently, as if aware each object carried memory. He joined her, brushing off an old saddle his wife once used, and together they worked in comfortable silence, the kind only shared by people who understood each other without speaking. At one point, Megan looked over her shoulder. "Grandpa, are you really going to leave this place?" Harold paused. "Someday," he said quietly, "but only to someone who respects it, someone who understands it." Her eyes softened in a way that made him look away for a moment, overwhelmed. By noon, the appraisal was complete. Linda closed her binder, almost hesitating. "Harold, I'll finalize the numbers this afternoon, but I can already tell you it's worth far more than anyone would guess, more than Sophie ever imagined." Harold smiled, a small, private smile. "Good, that means it'll get the care it deserves." As Linda prepared to leave, she touched his arm. "Whatever you decide, I'll make sure it's done right." He nodded, grateful. She drove away, leaving a plume of exhaust in the cold air. Harold and Megan stood together in the quiet yard, the farmhouse rising behind them like a silent guardian. She slipped her hand into his, and he felt something settle inside him. Not relief, not revenge, but clarity. This land wasn't meant to be stripped down, repainted, and flipped for quick profit. It wasn't meant to be claimed by people who saw it only in numbers. It deserved someone who would honor it, someone who would raise. Pack the memories built into every nail and every beam. Someone like Megan. As they walked toward the house, a new idea took shape in Harold's mind. Not one he had planned, not one he had even fully formed, but one that began as a spark deep in his chest. A possibility. A path forward. A move Sophie would never see coming. And it was only beginning to take shape. Harold had just finished tightening the latch on the back door when he heard the crunch of tires skidding too fast into his gravel driveway. He didn't need to look to know whose car it was. The energy alone, hot, impatient, pulsing with accusation, announced them before the doors even slammed. Mark barreled into the house without knocking. His face was flushed, breath sharp, hands shaking with a fury Harold hadn't seen since Mark was a teenager. "Dad," he barked, voice cracking with frustration, "why didn't you sign the papers? The facility needed everything finalized this week." Harold wiped his palms on a towel and leaned against the counter. "Because," he said calmly, "I'm not moving." Mark flung his arms out. "You can't just decide that. We've been trying to help you and you keep." Before he could finish, Sophie stormed in behind him, her heels clacking across the floor like gunshots. She threw her purse onto the table and pointed at Harold as if he were a defendant on trial. "You are blocking our financial future," she screamed. "Do you have any idea what you're putting us through? We've made plans, real plans, and you're sabotaging them out of stubbornness." Harold didn't move, didn't even blink. He'd expected anger, but not the raw desperation etched across her face. This wasn't frustration. It was fear, the fear of losing something she believed she already possessed. Megan hurried down the hallway the moment she heard the yelling. "Mom, stop!" she cried, rushing in front of Harold like a shield. She planted herself between him and the two adults towering over him. Her voice wavered, but her stance didn't. "You can't talk to Grandpa like that." Sophie rolled her eyes. "Megan, move, this is grown-up business." "No," Megan said, shaking her head. "You're yelling at him because he won't give you what you want. That's not grown-up. That's greedy." Mark flinched, but Sophie doubled down. "He owes us stability," she shouted. "He's had his time in this house. It's ours now." Harold looked at her long and hard, and in that moment, something inside him clicked into perfect clarity. This was who she truly was, not the polite daughter-in-law from holiday dinners, not the smiling planner of family vacations, but a woman whose ambition had grown so large it no longer recognized boundaries. He wasn't angry. He was simply done pretending not to see. He stepped forward gently, moving Megan aside with a reassuring hand. Then, without raising his voice, without a hint of theatrics, he walked to the side drawer of the kitchen desk. The room fell still. Mark frowned. "Dad, what are you doing?" Harold didn't answer. He opened the drawer, revealing the neat folder he had placed there earlier that morning. He lifted it carefully, the weight of it substantial not from paper but from consequence. Megan watched silently, her eyes widening with understanding. Sophie took a single impatient step forward, still ready to argue. Harold set the folder on the table, pulled out the documents, and slid them toward Mark and Sophie. "You should read," he said simply. Sophie snatched the top page with a scoff, then her expression changed instantly. Her mouth parted, but no sound came out. Her eyes darted down the document, then to the next, flipping through them with increasing panic. Mark leaned over her shoulder and froze mid-breath, his face drained of color. The trust papers lay open before them, every page stamped, notarized, and irrevocable, every legal detail making it abundantly clear. The farmhouse belonged to Harold for life, and after him to Megan. Exclusively. Permanently. Without their names anywhere. Sophie's hand shook violently. This isn't real," she whispered. "It's filed with the county," Harold replied softly. "Yesterday." Mark swallowed hard, stepping back like someone who had walked into the wrong room. "Dad, why would you?" Harold held his gaze. "I didn't do this to you, you did." Silence smothered the room, the kind that reveals truth with brutal honesty. Sophie slapped her hand on the table, voice trembling between rage and disbelief. "This is unfair. You had no right to." Harold raised one hand, steady and quiet. "Enough. You told me this house belonged to you, but it never did, and now the law agrees." Her breath hitched. She looked around the kitchen, the walls she'd planned to demolish, the countertops she meant to replace, like a dream collapsing in slow motion. Mark tried to speak again, but words caught in his throat. Megan reached for Harold's arm, holding it tightly, like she finally felt safe. Sophie, still staring at the document, wisped, aired the only thing left in her arsenal. "This isn't over." Harold nodded once. "No," he said, "it is." But the battlefield had already shifted. And she knew it. For a long, breathless moment, no one moved. The trust documents lay spread across the kitchen table like a quiet explosion. Legal ink where Sophie expected entitlement, notarized signatures where she expected control. The reality she'd built in her mind, new countertops, open floor plans, a life financed by Harold's memories, was evaporating right in front of her. She flipped through the pages again, more frantically this time. This can't be right," she stammered. "We receive nothing, not a penny, not even partial ownership." Her voice cracked into a shrill pitch. Harold remained steady. "That's correct." Sophie's face twisted with disbelief. "You're delusional," she snapped. "Absolutely delusional if you think this will hold up. You can't just cut family out like this. It's illegal. It's elder manipulation. It's—" A knock at the front door cut her off. No one moved to answer it. Finally, Megan stepped forward and opened it. Attorney Paul Whitman walked in calmly, brushed a bit of snow from his coat sleeve, and nodded at Harold. "Hope I'm not interrupting," he said, though his eyes clearly registered the chaos in the room. Sophie's jaw dropped. "What are you doing here?" Paul lifted a folder in his hand. "I was in the area and wanted to deliver the notarized statements you'll need, Harold. Everything is finalized. The trust is active, on record with the county, and legally binding." He placed the folder next to the documents already on the table. "And just to clarify, Mrs. Bennett, what he's done is entirely within his rights." Sophie's breath hitched. "You're siding with him." "I'm siding with the law," Paul replied evenly. She recoiled as if struck. Mark, who had remained silent until now, slowly sank into a chair. His hands shook slightly as he rubbed his palms together, eyes fixed on the floor. When he finally spoke, his voice was so weak it barely reached the space between them. "Dad, why would you do this?" Harold looked at his son, really looked at him. At the boy he'd raised, the man he'd tried to guide, the father who had let ambition and pressure rewrite his compass. "I didn't," Harold said softly. "You did." Mark's head jerked up. The words landed with a weight he couldn't dodge. "You chose not to protect our home," Harold continued. "You chose not to protect me. You let someone else decide what I was worth." His voice didn't tremble, it didn't harden, it simply carried truth. Actions have consequences, so does silence. Mark blinked rapidly, guilt pressing into every line of his face. "Dad, I thought we were helping. I didn't want." "You didn't stop her," Harold said. "That was enough." Silence crashed over the room. Megan had been standing near the counter, arms folded tightly against her chest. But when she heard her father's strained excuses, she couldn't hold herself together any longer. Tears welled and spilled in a sudden rush. "How could you both do this?" she cried. "Grandpa has always been there for us, always, and you treated him like he was disposable." Mark reached for her, but she stepped back sharply. "Don't," she said. "I don't want excuses." Sophie scoffed. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Megan, stop being dramatic." "Dramatic," Megan fired back. "You tried to steal his home." Sophie's face darkened in anger. "This house should have passed to us. We're his children. We're the ones building a future. It belongs to us now." "No," Paul interrupted calmly. "Legally it belongs to Harold, and eventually to Megan, permanently." The words were the final crack in Sophie's composure. She grabbed her purse with trembling hands and pointed at Harold, her voice low and venomous. "You'll regret this. I swear to you, you've ruined everything." Harold met her glare without flinching. "Everything you thought you were owed," he corrected. Sophie didn't answer. She simply seized Mark's coat sleeve and yanked him toward the door. "Come on," she hissed. "We're leaving." Mark hesitated only a second, but it was enough for Harold to see a small, faltering remorse in his eyes. Then he allowed himself to be pulled away. The front door slammed so violently, the windows rattled. In the sudden quiet that followed, Megan turned to her grandfather and broke into sobs, not from fear, but from the shame of what her parents had become. Harold wrapped an arm around her, steady and warm. "It's all right," he whispered. "Truth had to come out eventually." Paul nodded solemnly, gathering his papers. "They'll calm down," he said, "but this was necessary." Harold exhaled, feeling the weight shift inside him. Not gone, not light, but steadier. "They know now," he said quietly, "and this was only the beginning." The house felt different after they left, as if the air itself had exhaled a long-held breath. But the relief didn't comfort Harold. It only made him aware of how drained he truly was. When the last echo of Sophie's car faded down the road, he stepped outside and lowered himself onto the porch steps. The cold wood pressed through his jeans, but he didn't move. He needed the stillness. He needed the quiet. Winter wind swept softly across the fields, bending dried grass in slow waves. The farmhouse, usually a place of steady calm, now felt like a body after surgery, alive but sore, every nerve exposed. Harold folded his hands together, staring out at the property he had fought for, bled for, and protected, even from the people he once trusted most. He replayed the argument, not the shouting, but the look in Mark's eyes, that flicker of guilt swallowed by fear. It was the kind of look that lodged itself in a father's chest, heavy and hard to forget. Harold let out a slow breath, the kind that shook slightly at the end. The screen door creaked and Megan stepped outside, wrapping her coat tighter around her shoulders. She sat beside him without a word, knees pulled up, her head leaning gently against his arm. "You did the right thing, Grandpa," she said softly. Harold didn't answer immediately. He stared at the yard where her father used to play as a boy. "Did I?" he asked at last. "I never wanted it to come to this, not with my own son." Megan nodded, eyes fixed on the horizon. Doing the right thing doesn't always feel good. Sometimes it just feels necessary. Her words, simple and sincere, settled into him like warm coal in a cold stove, small, but enough to keep the heart beating. Inside, Harold's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. Megan went to retrieve it and walked back outside, handing it to him with a hesitant expression. "It's Dad," she murmured. Harold opened the message. "I'm sorry for how things went. Sophie's upset and I handled it badly. But Dad, can you please help us financially, just until we get back on our feet?" There it was, the pattern he had tried so many times to ignore. Apology followed by request. Guilt wrapped around need. The same cycle that had chipped away at their relationship 1 inch at a time. Harold read the message twice. Then he locked the phone and placed it face down beside him. He didn't reply. Megan didn't ask why. She already knew. The silence between them deepened, not awkward, not cold, just honest, the kind of silence that follows truth. But the world outside their porch wasn't so quiet. Within days, whispers began spreading through town, subtle at first, then sharper. People Harold had known for decades suddenly approached him with tilted heads and sympathetic eyes. "I heard you forced your son out of the inheritance. Sophie said you're not well, that you're confused. She said the trust wasn't your idea." Harold listened to each rumor with the same steady expression. He didn't defend himself. He didn't retaliate. After 72 years on this earth, he knew the difference between noise and truth. Rumors blew through town like winter wind, loud at first, then forgotten. But lies, even loud ones, always reveal one thing. Who needs them? Linda Price showed up one afternoon with a stack of fresh appraisal papers and a bag of muffins from the church bake sale. She didn't mention Sophie by name, but her raised eyebrow and slight smirk said enough. "Don't worry about the chatter," she told Harold. "People who know you know better, and the ones who do, they'll figure out the truth soon enough." She wasn't the only one. Neighbors who had shared fence lines with him for 40 years stopped by with words of support. Old clients from his carpentry days called to check on him. Even the church pastor, who rarely involved himself in community drama, remarked quietly, "A man's life speaks louder than another person's bitterness." For the first time in weeks, Harold felt something loosen inside him. Not triumph, not pride. Respect. The kind built over decades. The kind Sophie could never buy or manipulate. The kind Mark had forgotten the worth of. One evening, as Harold and Megan sat on the porch watching the sky darken into winter blue, she leaned her head against his shoulder again. "It's weird," she said softly. "Mom's trying so hard to turn people against you, but all it's doing is showing everyone who she really is." Harold let a slow smile settle on his face. "Respect outlasts lies," he said quietly. "It always has." Megan squeezed his arm, the truth of that settling into her young heart with a strength she would carry for the rest of her life. The porch lights flickered on automatically as night fully took the sky. The farm stood silent, steady, unshaken, no matter how hard the world outside tried to rattle it. But far down the road, headlights appeared in the distance. Someone was coming, and Harold knew the storm wasn't done with him yet. Sophie had never tasted defeat before, not real defeat, and it showed. The morning after the trust papers detonated her plans, she launched into damage control with the ferocity of someone drowning who refused to admit the water was rising. By 9 a.m., she was pacing the kitchen in her robe, dialing Paul Whitman's number with a speed that shook her fingertips. When he answered, her voice snapped into sugar-coated hostility. "Mr. Whitman, I think there's been a misunderstanding about the trust Harold filed. We need to discuss reversing." Paul cut her off before she could finish. "Mrs. Bennett, there is no misunderstanding. The documents were executed properly, filed properly, and finalized. The trust is irrevocable. There is nothing to reverse." Sophie's breath came out in a sharp, incredulous gasp. "I am his family. He was manipulated. This is elder coercion." "No," Paul said, voice flat as steel. "This is Harold exercising his legal rights with complete clarity, and I suggest you stop calling my office. There is no challenge you can file that will undo this." Then he hung up. Just like that. Without sympathy, without hesitation, without giving her room to spin another thread of manipulation. Sophie stared at the phone as though it had betrayed her. Then her expression hardened into something darker. She stormed into the living room where Mark sat on the couch, shoulders sagging under the weight of everything that had unfolded. He looked exhausted, eyes hollow, guilt lodged in the lines of his face. "You need to fight this," Sophie demanded. "Legally, he can't do this to us." Mark rubbed his temples. "Soph, maybe we should just let things calm down." "Calm down," she screeched. "Calm down. He cut us out of everything. Everything, Mark. The house, the land, the equity. We were supposed to use that to finally move forward." Mark looked at her for a long moment. "We were supposed to, or you were." She froze. It was the first crack. Mark continued, voice low. "You've been pushing this since summer, asking me to rush him, pressure him, bring in contractors before he even agreed to move. You didn't care if he got hurt. You cared about the house." Sophie's face contorted between rage and disbelief. "I won't apologize for wanting a better life. I'm not living in a starter home forever. I deserve more than that, and so do you." But Mark didn't answer this time. He just stared at her, something shifting behind his eyes, recognition maybe, or regret. She stepped closer. "You're his son, fight him." "No," Mark said quietly, "not like this." The refusal hit her like a slap. "You're weak," she spat. "Harold is manipulating you. Fine. If you won't do it, I'll handle everything myself." But even she seemed unsure how. For the rest of the day, they didn't speak. Sophie paced the house, muttering threats under her breath, slamming drawers as though the wood itself had betrayed her. She searched online our attorneys, ranted about rights she never actually had, called her sister to complain about being robbed blind. But nothing gave her footing. Meanwhile, Mark sat in the bedroom, staring at the wall, finally seeing the truth he had ignored for too long. This wasn't about caring for his father. It was about feeding Sophie's greed. By late afternoon, something in him broke loose. He grabbed his coat and keys and walked out without telling her where he was going. The drive to the farmhouse felt heavier than the snow clouds gathering overhead. Mark parked by the fence and sat for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel, trying to summon words he wasn't sure he had anymore. But eventually he stepped out, boots sinking into slushy ground, and walked to the porch where Harold sat mending a tool handle. Harold looked up, surprised but not unkind. "Didn't expect you today," he said softly. Mark swallowed hard. "Dad, I'm sorry for everything." Harold nodded once, waiting. "I didn't know it would go this far," Mark continued. "I thought we were helping. And then Sophie, she kept pushing. I should have stopped her. I should have been," his voice cracked. "I should have been better." Harold studied his son's face, really studied it. The shame there, the fear. The small boy who used to run through these fields, now trapped in a man who'd lost his way. He could have been angry. He could have yelled, accused, demanded. Instead, his voice held only sadness. "Mark, I wasn't hurt by your questions. I was hurt by your silence." Mark looked away, eyes burning. Harold set the tool aside, folding his hands in his lap. "You let her decide what I was worth, and I don't know how we fix that yet." The wind rolled across the porch, cold and raw, pressing that truth between them. Mark bowed his head. "I want to try." Harold nodded slowly. "Trying starts with honesty, nothing else." Mark wiped his eyes with the back of his sleeve. He looked less like a man now and more like someone finally waking up, late, but waking all the same. Behind him, the sky darkened and winter crept closer. The road ahead, between father and son and between both of them and Sophie, was still stormed over. And none of them knew what would break next. Winter loosened its grip slowly that year, as if reluctant to leave the farmhouse behind. The snow that once blanketed the fields began to thin into slush, then melt entirely, revealing patches of stubborn winter grass and long-forgotten fence lines. Weeks passed in this quiet transition, a season thawing, a man reclaiming control, a family fracture settling into its inevitable shape. Harold spent those weeks in steady, deliberate motion. Some days he repaired loose boards on the porch. Other days he packed old belongings into boxes, not out of urgency but out of contemplation. He walked the property at dawn, breathing in the cold air as if memorizing it, letting each field remind him of who he had been, who he had become, and who he still needed to protect. He didn't hurry the decision. He let it rise naturally, the way winter yields to early spring, first a hint, then a certainty. One afternoon, Linda returned. She stepped out of her car holding a thick binder and an envelope sealed with her office's crest. She handed them to Harold with a quiet smile. "Final valuation," she said. "And Harold, it's even higher than I estimated." Harold chuckled softly, shaking his head at the numbers before him. "My wife would be grinning," he murmured. "She always said this place was worth more than people realized." Linda nodded. She was right. They sat at the kitchen table, warm tea between them, appraisal papers spread neatly. Linda didn't pressure him. She simply explained the process, the listing options, the timing. And when she finished, Harold folded his hands and spoke with calm conviction. "I'm selling, not to escape, not because they try to push me out. I'm selling because it's time, on my terms." Linda's eyes softened. "Then we do it the right way." Megan arrived after school, dropping her backpack by the door. When she saw the appraisal binder, she froze for a moment. "Is it happening?" she asked cautiously. Harold reached for her hand. "Yes, but only because I'm ready, not because they forced me. You and I were going to find somewhere peaceful, somewhere where no one can touch what we build." Her shoulders relaxed with a long exhale. Then she hugged him, arms wrapped tightly, gratitude spilling into the gesture. "Grandpa, wherever you go, I go." The decision, once made, carried no regret. A crisp February morning arrived. Sunlight bright, air sharp, the ground firm enough to hold the weight of change. Linda pulled up the long gravel drive with a large wooden sign in the back of her SUV. She stepped out wearing gloves and a determined smile. "Ready?" she asked. Harold nodded, Megan standing proudly beside him. Linda drove the signpost into the earth near the property's edge. With a final swing of her mallet, she secured the white and red board that announced a new future. "For sale, BNNETT farmhouse and acreage." The sign caught the sunlight, bold and impossible to ignore. Harold studied it quietly, not in sadness but in acceptance. This wasn't the end of his story. It was the next chapter he'd chosen for himself. Megan squeezed his arm. "It looks right," she said. He nodded. "It does." Just then, the distant hum of an engine grew louder, a familiar sound, one he recognized instantly. A dark SUV approached from the bend in the road, gaining speed, until it reached the stretch of fence running parallel to the front yard. It was them. Mark driving, Sophie in the passenger seat. Harold didn't move. He didn't have to. The car rolled closer, close enough for the sign to come into full view. Then everything happened at once. The SUV jerked violently. Tires skidded. Brakes screamed against the asphalt. The car fishtailed slightly before stopping halfway across the road, angled toward the farmhouse like an animal bracing for attack. Inside the vehicle, Sophie sat frozen, eyes wide, mouth parted, staring at the sign as if it were a detonated bomb. She fumbled with the window controls until it slid down, wind whipping her hair wildly. "HES selling it himself," she shouted, voice cracking with disbelief, fury, and something that sounded very close to panic. Mark stared too, shock draining the color from his face, but he said nothing. Maybe because he understood. Maybe because, deep down, he knew this moment wasn't about a house. It was about consequence. Sophie slapped her palm against the dashboard. "He can't do this. He can't. This place should have been ours." Harold simply stood there, hands in his coat pockets, the winter sun warm on his back. For the first time since Christmas Eve, Sophie was seeing the truth. He wasn't the old man she could corner. He wasn't the weak link in her plans. He was the one writing the ending. Linda stepped slightly in front of Harold, protective without being confrontational. Megan stood beside him, chin lifted. And Sophie, speechless now, stared at the sign that spelled out her failure in bold red letters. The wind blew hard across the field. The sign didn't move. Neither did Harold. But Sophie's world had just shifted. And she wasn't done fighting. Not yet. The moment Sophie's scream tore through the cold February air, every bird in the trees scattered. She flung open the SUV door before it had even fully stopped, boots slipping on the icy shoulder as she sprinted toward the yard with the wild, frantic energy of someone who had just seen their future vanish in a single wooden sign. "Harold," she screeched, voice shrill enough to cut through the wind. "Harold." But Harold didn't move. He stood beside the FOR sale sign, hands in his coat pockets, posture steady, the winter sun at his back. There was no triumph in his expression, only a quiet certainty, the kind that comes from truth finally standing in daylight. Sophie skidded to a stop a few feet from him, her breath coming in white, furious bursts. "How dare you?" she yelled. "How dare you do this without discussing it with us?" Harold lifted his gaze to her, calm as still water. There wasn't anything left to discuss. "You're ruining our life," Sophie cried, throwing her arms out toward the house. "Do you understand that? You've destroyed our plans, our future, All because you're being spiteful." Harold didn't raise his voice. He didn't flinch. He simply spoke with the clarity of a man who had carried his pain long enough. "You tried to steal mine," he said. The words hit her harder than the winter cold. She blinked, stunned, as if she had never once considered that her actions might be seen from someone else's vantage point, especially the man she had intended to push out of his own home like an unwanted guest. Mark finally caught up, breathless snow collecting on his coat. "Dad," he started, hands raised in a gesture of pleading, "please just hear us out." Harold didn't look at him. "I heard you both out months ago," he said. "You just didn't know I was listening." Mark shut his eyes. That was the wound he couldn't hide from, the kitchen whisper he couldn't erase. "Dad, I'm sorry," he murmured. "I really am. I didn't mean for it to." Harold cut him off with a small, steady shake of his head. "Sorry doesn't undo what you stood by and allowed." Mark swallowed hard. Shame contorted his face. But Harold didn't step forward to comfort him. Not yet. Wounds needed truth before healing. Behind them, Megan stood near the porch, her phone held discreetly but firmly in her hand. She wasn't recording for revenge. She was recording because the last time Sophie had cornered them, the truth had nearly been buried under her lies. This time, nothing would be hidden. Sophie noticed the phone and snapped toward Megan. "Are you filming me? Seriously, turn that off." "No," Megan said, voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Not until you stop lying about us. Not until you stop twisting everything." Sophie's face reddened with rage. "I am not lying. Your grandfather is manipulating all of this. He's confused, he's unstable." Linda, who had been quietly observing from a few yards away, stepped closer. "Harold's more clear-headed than anyone I've ever represented," she said. "And you know it." Sophie spun toward her. "Stay out of this." "I'm his realtor," Linda replied calmly. "I'm very much in this." Other neighbors, drawn by the shouting and the newly planted sign, began slowing their cars as they passed. A few rolled down their windows. Others lingered at the property edge, witnessing the confrontation unfold like a scene from a courtroom drama where no one could hide behind closed doors. And Sophie realized it. She saw the eyes, the attention, the witnesses. Her fury faltered, not because she regretted anything, but because she had never expected to be exposed. "You can't do this," she hissed at Harold, lowering her voice as if finally aware of the growing audience. "This house should have been ours. We deserved it." Harold answered with the same soft finality. "Respect is deserved, property is not." The wind carried his words further than he expected. Enough people heard them that the shift in the crowd's expression was unmistakable. Sophie looked around, panic starting to replace rage. The narrative she'd been spinning in town, Harold confused, Harold unreasonable, Harold manipulated, crumbled in seconds beneath the simple, undeniable truth. He was standing on his own property, in full command of his decisions. She was yelling on land that never belonged to her. And people could see it. Mark touched Sophie's arm. "Maybe we should go," he whispered. She jerked away. "No, I'm not leaving until." But she faltered again when she saw Megan's phone still recording, and Linda watching, and neighbors murmuring behind cupped hands. For the first time, Sophie looked small. Not defeated yet, but cornered. Her voice cracked. "This isn't fair." Harold stepped back from the sign, letting the truth speak for itself. "Fair," he said softly, "left this house the moment you tried to take it." Sophie trembled with rage and humiliation, but she had no weapons left. Not here, not publicly, not with witnesses. She pointed at him one last time, finger shaking. "This isn't over," she whispered. Harold didn't react. Because he knew. It was already over. She just hadn't accepted it yet. The FOR sale sign had barely settled into the February soil before the calls started coming in. At first, Harold thought Linda was exaggerating when she said interest would be high. But within 48 hours, the farmhouse listing spread through town like wildfire. People who had driven past the property their whole lives suddenly wanted a chance at it. Older couples, young families, even local preservation groups called Linda nonstop. By the end of the week, she stood in Harold's kitchen holding a stack of printed offers so thick it looked like a phone book. "I told you," Linda said with a warm, proud smile. "This place is special. Folks feel that." What shocked the town wasn't just the price, though the offers came in far above anyone's predictions. It was the reverence. People wanted to keep the barn intact, maintain the fields, honor the Bennett history. They weren't looking to bulldoze or flip. They wanted to preserve. Linda set the strongest offer on the table. "This one," she said, tapping the top page, "comes from the Harrisons, local family. They've admired your property for years. They wrote a letter too, said they'd treat it like a member of the family." Harold read the letter slowly. He felt his wife beside him in every sentence. The Harrisons spoke of legacy, of land stewardship, of keeping traditions alive. They even mentioned Megan, saying they hoped she'd visit whenever she wished and see the place thriving. He felt his throat tighten. He signed the acceptance. The farmhouse, his life's work, was finally going to people who cherished it, not people who wanted to strip it for parts. But not everyone greeted the decision with respect. Later that afternoon, Mark showed up in a panic, stumbling up the porch steps. "Dad, please, please don't do this." His voice shook with desperation. "We can figure things out, just don't sell, not yet, give us time." Harold looked at him, not with anger, not with triumph, just with the kind of tired compassion that comes from seeing someone too late. "Mark," he said softly, "I gave you time, more than you realized." Mark's shoulders collapsed. "I didn't mean for everything to go as far as it did. Sophie kept—" He stopped, guilt choking off the sentence. Harold raised a hand. "I know, and I'm sorry she dragged you into her greed, but selling this house isn't about punishing you. It's about protecting what's left of me." Mark lowered his gaze, unable to argue, unable to repair what he had allowed to break. "I can't reconsider," Harold finished quietly. The truth settled between them like winter ash. Mark left without another word. The following month, Harold and Megan moved out of the farmhouse and into a cozy lakeside cottage an hour away. The place wasn't large, just 2 bedrooms, a stone fireplace, and a deck overlooking still winter water, but it felt peaceful in a way the farmhouse hadn't in a long time. It had no echoes of betrayal, no footsteps of people plotting behind doors, no walls whispering the weight of what Sophie tried to claim. The first night, they sat together on the deck, wrapped in blankets, sipping hot cocoa while the lake reflected streaks of fading sunset. "It's quiet," Megan said with a small laugh, her cheeks pink from the cold. "Quiet's not a bad thing," Harold replied, nudging her shoulder. "Quiet means no one's yelling about realtors or renovations." She snorted, "Thank God." They spent days unpacking slowly. No rush, no deadlines. Megan decorated her room with drawings and photographs she'd saved. Harold filled the bookshelves with tools, journals, and the few mementos he'd kept from the farm. In the evenings, they warmed their hands by the fire, laughing over board games, cooking simple meals, rediscovering what family felt like without fear or tension. Peace, Harold realized, wasn't the absence of conflict. Peace was the presence of someone who truly loved you. But in that peace lived another truth, one he had been avoiding for weeks. He hadn't lost a son. He'd lost someone who had stopped being one long before the trust documents were signed. The grief of that recognition didn't crush him. It just settled quietly into his bones, asking to be acknowledged. When he allowed himself to feel it, Megan sat beside him, slipping her hand into his without asking what was wrong. She had become his anchor, the steady presence reminding him of what still mattered, of who still cared, of why the fight had been worth it. Late one night, as the moon shimmered across the lake, Megan leaned her head against his shoulder. "You deserved better, Grandpa," she whispered, "and you finally have it now." Harold exhaled slowly, letting the words wrap around him like warmth. Yes, for the first time in a long time, he did. But even in this new beginning, a faint uncertainty stirred in the distance, because the past, especially when tangled with family, rarely stays buried for long. And somewhere out there, consequences were still circling. Spring settled around the lakeside cottage with a softness Harold hadn't felt in years. The days grew longer, the water warmed, and life, simple, quiet life, began to feel like something he could trust again. Megan returned from school each afternoon with stories and drawings, laughter filling rooms that for decades had echoed with grief and obligation. Harold had just finished sweeping the deck one warm evening when he heard a car pull up the gravel path. Not fast, not aggressive, slow, cautious. He set the broom aside, wiping his palms on his jeans as he walked toward the porch steps. Mark stepped out of the car. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He just stood there, shoulders slumped, eyes tired in a way Harold had never seen on his son's face. Months had passed since their last confrontation, months of silence, rumors, and consequences settling into their rightful places. "Dad," Mark said quietly, voice barely carrying across the yard. Can I talk to you?" Harold nodded once. "Come on up." Mark climbed the porch steps slowly, as if each one were heavier than the last. When he finally reached the top, he didn't sit. He just stood there, turning his wedding ring with restless fingers, until Harold noticed. He wasn't wearing it. Mark caught the glance and swallowed hard. "She left," he said, the words falling out flat and hollow. "Sophie. She walked out 2 months after the trust was filed, said I failed her, said I didn't fight hard enough to get the farm back. She moved in with her sister, packed up everything and didn't look back." Harold didn't answer right away. He let the silence rest between them, soft, not punishing. Mark dragged a hand through his hair. "I thought she loved me," he whispered, "but I guess she loved the idea of what she could get out of me more." He sank onto the porch rail, elbows on his knees. For a long moment he stared at the lake, voice trembling. "I was stupid, Dad. I let her get into my head. I let her twist things, make me believe you were the problem. And all that time, I should have been standing up for you, for us." Harold's gaze softened. "Marriage can blind people, happens more than you think." "No," Mark said sharply, shaking his head. "No excuses. I chose her wants over your dignity. I let her push me into becoming someone I don't even recognize. Someone who'd stand by while she tried to take your home. Mom's home." His voice cracked, and Harold felt a familiar ache bloom in his chest. "I'm sorry," Mark whispered. "For everything, for the pressure, for the lies I let happen, for no. T being the son you raised me to be." Harold studied him, not as a judge, but as a father seeing wounds beneath the surface. He didn't feel anger. Not anymore. The fight was long over, and bitterness had nowhere left to grow. "Sit down," Harold said gently. Mark sat beside him on the porch steps, staring at his hands. "You want to rebuild trust," Harold said quietly. "I can hear that." Mark nodded fast, desperate. I really do, but I don't know how, I don't know where to start." Harold turned toward him fully. His voice was steady, calm, almost tender, with honesty, nothing else. Mark closed his eyes, the weight of those words washing over him. Honesty, something Sophie had starved out of their home long before she ever tried to take Harold's. "I can do that," Mark whispered. "I want to do that." "Good," Harold said. "Then we start there." They sat quietly as the lake rippled under the evening light. Somewhere behind them, Megan peeked through the window, relief softening her features when she saw the two of them sitting together, not healed, not whole, but facing the same direction at last. Mark wiped his eyes again, but this time his voice steadied. "Dad, can I come by sometimes? Not to talk about the past, just to visit." Harold nodded slowly. "You can." A fragile peace settled between them, thin as spring ice but real. A beginning. As the sun dipped behind the trees and the water darkened to deep blue, Harold felt something shift. Not dramatic, not triumphant, just a small opening where resentment had once lived. Maybe this was what rebuilding looked like. Not immediate forgiveness. Not erasing the past. Just choosing to step forward without carrying its weight. He glanced at Mark, who sat quietly, shoulders lowered, breathing deeper than when he arrived. Healing had begun, fragile, slow, uncertain. But it had begun. The road to the old farmhouse felt different now, lighter somehow, as if the weight it once carried had been lifted from Harold's shoulders and set gently onto the earth where it belonged. He drove slowly, letting the familiar curves and dips of the rural lane pull him back through time. The trees were budding, early spring leaves trembling like small green flags of renewal. The closer he came to the property, the more the memories gathered. His wife's laughter drifting across summer fields, Mark as a boy chasing chickens, every nail and board shaped by a young man who once thought the world couldn't take anything from him. He pulled into the driveway and let the truck idle. The farmhouse stood tall and beautifully restored, not with modern flash but with reverence. The new owners, the Harrison family, had honored the home with gentle touches. Fresh paint in the same warm cream color his wife chose, repaired shutters, the porch swing polished instead of replaced. It looked loved. A small boy spotted Harold through the window and bolted outside, followed by his parents. "Mr. Bennett," the mother called, waving with a wide, genuine smile. They walked toward him with a warmth that dissolved whatever nervousness he had carried here. "We hope it's okay we made a few repairs," the father said, shaking Harold's hand firmly. "We wanted to keep everything as close to how your wife had designed it." Harold's throat tightened, emotion rising like a tide he didn't expect. "It's perfect," he said quietly. "Absolutely perfect." They offered him the porch for a final walkthrough, but Harold declined with a gentle smile. "I'm not here to visit the house," he said. "I'm here to say goodbye to it." Across the yard, Megan stepped out of the truck and walked over to him. She slipped her hand into his, her grip warm and sure. "It's beautiful, Grandpa," she whispered. "Yes," he said, eyes scanning the familiar lines of the roof, the shape of the barn, the tree his wife planted the year Mark was born. "It is." The Harrison family returned to the porch, giving him space but remaining close enough to share their gratitude. Their simple kindness struck him harder than any betrayal ever had. After a few minutes, Megan wrapped both arms around him from the side, resting her head against his shoulder. "Grandpa," she said softly, voice thick with sincerity, "you saved us." Harold closed his eyes, absorbing the truth in her words. Not saved a house, not saved money or land. Saved them. Their peace. Their dignity. Their future. He hugged her back, slow and full, the kind of embrace that said more than words ever could. When she pulled away, he looked at the farmhouse again, and this time it wasn't memory he saw but clarity. He realized the betrayal Sophie had attempted wasn't just about property. It wasn't about the structure or the land or the market value. It was about erasing him, erasing his wife's legacy, erasing the story carved into every plank of wood. She hadn't just tried to claim a house, she had tried to rewrite his life in her image. But the house had answered her. Not with force, not with rage, b. With truth. The house had remained loyal to the hands that built it, to the marriage that raised it, to the child who once laughed in its hallways and the granddaughter who protected it when no one else did. It was never hers to take. It had never even looked in her direction. He let out a slow exhale, the last remnants of bitterness leaving his chest with it. Now it belonged to people who respected the history, People who walked the floors with reverence instead of entitlement. People who understood that homes are not stepping stones. They're stories you inherit with humility. The Harrison boy waved at Harold again, shouting, "Come back and visit any time." Harold laughed, a soft, warm laugh that hadn't existed during the dark months of betrayal. "Maybe I will," he said, though he knew this visit was his last in the way that mattered. He and Megan walked back to the truck together. She opened his door for him, and he chuckled at her insistence. "You know," he said as he settled into the seat, "your grandma would have liked you bossing me around." "I learned from the best," Megan replied, climbing into her own seat. As Harold started the engine, he took one last look at the farmhouse. A final, quiet farewell to a chapter that had defined his life more deeply than any other. "She wanted the house for herself," he murmured, almost to the wind. "But in the end, it was the house that revealed who truly belonged."